Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Alt Proteins in APAC 2023 State of the Industry webinar. I'm Valerie Pang, and I'm the Innovation Associate at GFI APAC. So before we get started, I will share a few things first. So first of all, a short introduction of GFI APAC, also known as the Goodfoot Institute Asia Pacific. Headquartered in Singapore, GFI APAC is part of a network of leading alt protein think tanks located in 6 regions across the globe. We accelerate a shift towards a more secure, sustainable, and just food system through open access R&D, corporate engagement, and public policy. So my second announcement is that this webinar will be recorded. We're going to post a recording on our YouTube channel and email a recording of the webinar within the next few days. So if you missed part of it or didn't catch something, no worries, we'll send it to you so you can revisit it later on. And the agenda for today is as follows. Our speakers, Jennifer Morton and Divya Gandhi, will be giving a presentation for about 45 minutes, and this will be followed by a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session with the audience. So for the Q&A session, may we request that you type your questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat, and so this helps us to keep track of them more easily. So with that, we shall get started with our 2023 State of the Industry webinar. It is my pleasure to introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker is Jennifer Morton, GFI APAC's Corporate Engagement Manager, working to widen and deepen engagement and partnerships across the alt protein supply chain. Prior to joining GFI, Jennifer was a strategy consultant for over 5 years in the Netherlands and Singapore, focused on sustainability, social impact, and agriculture. And our second speaker is Divya Gandhi, GFI APAC's Research Associate. Prior to joining GFI, Divya worked in consulting and strategy for 8 years. She has experience working with governments and donor partners, including the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, on large-scale strategic and project implementation advisory engagements. So now I shall hand over the time to Jennifer and Divya for their presentation. So Jennifer, take it away.
Thanks, Valerie. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for joining us. Seeing a lot of activity in the chat already, which is great. And before I dive in, I want to talk a bit about what was our goal with this report. So our goal with this report was really to provide this central resource that pulls together all the key data and insights about the sector in the region. We have a lot of global reports of GFI, and we have kind of peppered insights and data about APAC, but we wanted one place where we could pull together all that information, as well as do some primary data collection. So we've done a consumer insight study, which is still in progress, but we have some highlights for you in this report. So that was really our goal, to have this sector report for us all to build more knowledge about the region. And the goal of today is to present the key highlights, show how we're moving forward across the different parts of the ecosystem. And our goal is obviously to ignite action. So around some of those areas that we've spotlighted in terms of the gaps and the needs. And we are obviously your partner to be doing this in the future. But this is a great place to kind of begin. So going on to, this is basically our table of contents that I've copied from the report, but I want to talk about why we structured it this way. And we wanted to look at the sector as a pipeline, because if we only focus on something like R&D, then we're going to be bottlenecked, because the question is, how do we move between these stages? So it's great if we have a lot of R&D activity, but how do we move from lab to pilot to demo to scale? What enablers do we need from financing, or are there other enablers? And who should be doing what? So we wanted to take this pipeline view and kind of walk through what's happening each stage. How is the ecosystem being built, but also how is it not being built? Where is there a really key actor that needs to be present at a particular stage that is not? So we wanted to take this pipeline view so we can see from a pipeline perspective, where are the gaps in the sector? And we also wanted to use this report to show how APAC can be thought of as a pipeline. So we know we need to fund R&D and de-risk this journey to scale up, but different countries in APAC have different capabilities at different stages of this journey. So we wanted to show, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, Australia, they're, at the R&D hub phase. Singapore is creating the startup hub. China and Southeast Asia are the manufacturing giants. But how do they all coordinate, and how do they all kind of gel together? So this whole kind of report is really predicated on this view of the pipeline. So if you go into our report, you'll see this mirrored, and this is the structure we'll have today. So we'll go through these sections, collapse them a little bit because we can only present the key insights, but you can follow with the tracker at the top that will appear in a couple of slides to orient yourself where we are in the report, in the pipeline, and our presentation today. So before we go into APAC, I want to zoom out and look at the macro picture. Often if we look at the headlines, we're always zoomed in on what's happening in this particular quarter or this particular year. But if we take this long-term view, where are we globally as a sector? And I want to highlight 3 of the powerful growth drivers which we see in the sector that's propelling us forward. And the first is the cost of novel technologies have been falling for the last decade. So we estimate that cultivated meat has declined by about 99% when the first burger was made back in 2013. And it's difficult to get estimations on this number, but we're our kind of estimate as GFI is we're kind of north of $100 per kilogram for cultivated meat. And we have precision fermentation, obviously produces a range of molecules, but we also see that more complex molecules are being produced at the same kind of bracket of cost. So this is all because of better technology and learning by doing that's enabling us to climb down the cost curve. Second, public funding. So we see that this has been critical to R&D and commercialization. We've seen a 60% increase from 2022 against all-time funding up to 2021, so a considerable increase in 2021 to 2022. This has been really important to fuel much of the R&D breakthroughs we'll cover in this report. So this has been critical, and we'll see why governments are more important now than ever in the sector in later slides. And then third, the market opportunity. So not on the supply side, but also on the demand side, we do see a lot of latent demand. So in APAC, this is our survey that we did on Southeast Asia. We see over 50% have not even tried these products, but over 80% really want to try them or want to eat more. So there is this opportunity for various reasons that we need to tap into in the sector. Obviously, we are not resolved. So with all of these growth drivers, there's also a challenge. And what is that challenge? So in terms of costs, the cost curves have fallen, but they must continue to fall, probably by about another tenfold. So we're targeting mass market commodities, and that has a limited willingness to pay, which is something we'll discuss later. And so we really need to find out, how do we do this? How do we lower the costs? Is it just better technology? Is it smart scaling strategies where we're targeting high value markets in the early days? We need to be really cognizant of what are consumers willing to pay, and then how do we actually get there? And we'll be discussing some of that later on. The second is really contextualizing public funding. So, we saw the 1 billion for APAC. Is that a lot? Well, if we look at this overall chart, we see, well, not very much. And this is all-time public funding for alternative proteins, which is about $1 billion. But low carbon transport is about 86 billion in one single year compared to all-time funding for alt proteins. And we chose this sector to compare it to because both have a similar climate footprint of somewhere over 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So we can really see that there's a huge opportunity with alt proteins, but if we put that number in context, we see that there's so much more to go. And actually the number is quite negligible when we look at what governments are doing in other sectors. And then product quality. So yes, consumers are interested. There are reasons why they're interested, but product quality and cost must improve. So this is no surprise, I'm sure, to any of you on the call, but the biggest barrier we found in our consumer survey is cost. And then once you overcome that cost hurdle, you need to build a value proposition for the consumer. And that's looking at nutrition and taste. But we'll go into those in a lot more detail. So upshot is, a lot of progress, but significantly more needs to be made across these enablers as well as others. So now we'll go into the first section that we want to cover, and that's looking at government support and R&D. And in terms of the key takeaways, so the first is really that it's a very important time for governments. Governments need to enable the private sector, especially as we've seen private funding decrease in the last, particularly this year and last year. And governments really have a role, not just funding R&D, but really to build enabling environments to unlock private capital. So they have a really significant role to play right now in the sector. Second, so we discussed as funding is up, more funding and support is something that we hear a lot. But we've looked here at the broader climate picture to understand, that it's not just about the scale of funding, but it's also very interesting to look at the share of funding. So how much is the public sector committing relative to the private sector, and also the timing. So when is it important that governments come in to deliver that funding? I think looking at other climate sectors and other transitions can offer some clues about what we really need to do in alternative proteins to succeed. And then the third is looking at research institutes. So we want to highlight that research is accelerating. We'll spotlight some of the research institutes and what they are doing. But there are some regionally specific research gaps that we at GFI APAC think it's important that the sector also funds, as well as this global foundational research, really understanding how does that translate into what we need in the region. So then starting with the funding totals. So if we look at, unlike private funding, what's been happening in government funding, and it's been continuing to climb. So if we look at the top, we see all-time funding is over 1 billion globally, and we estimate that APAC governments are about 16% of this all-time total, about 160 or so million, and we saw a 37% increase, which you can see in the bottom graph, between all time to 2021 and then to 2022. So a significant increase relative to previous years in the past year, or 2021 to 2022. In the report, we talk about the high-level endorsement that the sector has received, including from the PMs of China and Japan. And we also look at what's been happening on the regulatory side. So for cultivated meat, obviously Singapore was the first country to approve, but we have an assessment underway under the existing framework in Australia and New Zealand for cultivated meat. And we have developments for cultivated meat regulatory approval pathways underway in Japan, South Korea, and as of 2023, Thailand and Malaysia as well. So there is certainly a lot of government activity going on, both on the funding side as well as the regulatory and policy side. But as I mentioned, the thing that really stood out to us is thinking, how do we contextualize this number? Is this 1 billion big? Is this 160 million for APAC big? How do we make sense of this? And here what we see on the screen is looking at emissions relative to total financing. And we can see, is this big or small, or is this tailored to the impact? And we see that no. If we look on the left, it's the percentage of global greenhouse gas emissions according to the latest IPCC report. And on the right-hand side, we see global climate financing. So this is total public as well as total private financing together. And if we look on the left, and we see the kind of mismatch in the bars, we see how much emissions is it contributing, and then how much is that being attracted by public and private support. And we see, particularly for other agri and meat production at the bottom, that it's very much mismatched. Out of this total, so we see about somewhere between a quarter and a third of global greenhouse gas emissions are from the food sector, depending on the source that you use. Here, I've been conservative and estimated the lower end, say a quarter. And we see that agriculture is only attracting about 3% of global climate flows as of 2020, and proteins is around error, it's 0.5%, even though it contributes over 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So there's really a big case for increasing public funding because of the impact that it has the potential to have. But I mentioned that it's also interesting to not just look at the scale, but also the share, and look at how is global public financing and global private financing stacking up to each other. So here, if I draw your eye to the left-hand side, we see that governments have funded over half of total climate financing for sectors in 2020. But if you look on the right, we see that for alt proteins, the public share of all-time financing is just 7%. So why is this important? Well, we know that for the early deployment of technology, whether it's because it's higher cost in the beginning or because it has lower revenue potential for a company, it's really important to find those niche offerings. The cost curves. Tech like software, where you can quickly prototype, put it into the market, and you have dramatic user benefits, and then you can build revenue while continuing to scale. But we see something like alternative proteins, we're aiming for a mass market commodity, that there's limited willingness to pay a premium, as we'll see when we go to our consumers. And so we really need this government incentives, government support coming at the early stage to offset some of the risk and shape these early markets. We've seen that happen with renewables, with higher priced offtake agreements, And we need to ask, can the alt protein sector really scale without this early de-risking support? And maybe it can, but it would take much more time, and it would be much more successful if we can really crowd in the government and philanthropy at this stage. And I think looking at the share of financing really shows that if we need to set up for success, as like other climate transitions, we really need this to be more balanced between public and private sector, and understand how do they work together to help de-risk these early markets. So it's a mixed story. So yes, it's great, it's increasing, but there's still a lot more to do, particularly on the public sector side. So then moving to the research side. So I hope it's clear from the last slide, but governments do not only fund R&D, they have a much bigger remit beyond that they can benefit this sector, whether that's commercialization funding, but it's also this whole package of incentives to help scale these technologies into the market in a way that consumers are willing to pay. But here I will dive into the R&D side, which has been definitely enabled by the public funding that has been received so far. And what you see on the slide is a mapping of the research institutes. So our methodology here was looking at various publication engines and industry keywords to see how many publications have been published in the area of alternative proteins since 2020. And we see that almost a third of these were in Q1 to Q2 2023. So significant activity going on in the R&D sphere in APAC. We see on the left-hand side in the table that Singapore is home to 3 of the region's 5 most active research centers. And we also have CSIRO in Australia coming in second in terms of overall publications from the university or the research institute, as well as Korea University coming in third. In the report, we go into more detail on the key publications that have been published across these different research institutes. So you can read a bit more about their findings, which we've all linked and summarized in there. And we've also mapped the courses on offer in academic institutions, as well as the different student chapters that we have ongoing for talent development. So for all the researchers on the call, please use that resources to help you to find other research institutes for collaboration and so on. And you can see from these numbers, which we've split by pillar, which companies or which research institutes are really focusing on a particular sub area of different alternative protein technologies. But as this call is about, and this report is really also about the progress, but also the gaps, we also want to show some of the areas of regional research that we think would warrant a bit more attention because of their relevance in an APAC context. So over all the way on the left in the box, you see developing seafood species research toolkits for cultivated seafood. The reason this is really important in our region is because 72% of fish production is in Asia, and the per capita consumption of fish is double in this part of the world. So, but comparatively little is known about kind of biology of these aquatic species and the cell types relevant for cultivated seafood. So we see a lot more work in the alternative seafood side would be really helpful to meet consumers in terms of the protein sources that they're currently eating. The second box is talking about the crops and the side streams. So APAC is also the world's largest producer of agricultural commodities, but we know that there's much untapped, both for plant proteins. So looking at what is existingly grown in the region, so mung beans, for example, but also at feedstocks. So the different feedstocks and cell media inputs that can be derived from some of the crops that are already grown or could be grown with great success in APAC. So that's been very neglected. We just have a report that came out that catalogs that in the US context, but we're yet to have that in the APAC context. The third one there is about microbial screening. So there are minimal numbers of microbial strains used in fermentation that are available for alt proteins. And while there's work ongoing here, there's little about microorganisms that are important in tropical ecosystems. So a lot has been done in temperate regions, but less so in tropical ecosystems. So in terms of that research, we see a significant need to have a regional lens there. And then the final bucket over on the right is about LCAs and TEAs. So we think that APAC could be a really important scaling hub. We'll talk about that more, but no TEAs have been done in any Asian country to really understand the cost and the opportunities here in terms of scaling, say, precision fermentation and cultivated meat. And we also have done no LCAs for alternative seafood globally. So that's something, as I mentioned, is important protein source for this region, is a gap that we would love to close. So then I'll move on to the industry development. And here, what I'll go into is looking at how investments are diversifying. So across regions, across production pillars, and across focus areas, by which I mean B2B versus B2C. We'll go into the private investment, and we see deals have surpassed $1 billion USD in APAC, but obviously this decline, which I'm sure you're all aware of, in Q1, Q2 2023. And I'll also go into some of the highlights that we've been seeing happening on the corporate side. So corporates in-house, as well as corporate partnerships with startups, as well as looking at what's been happening in the startup side in terms of the ecosystem development there. So first, I mentioned diversification. So let's break this down a little bit more in terms of what we've been seeing. So on the left-hand side, we have it by region, and we can see between 2010 and 2021, 73% of investment was in the US in alternative proteins. This is private investment, and only 6% was in Asia. But if we fast forward to 2022, the APAC share had increased to 19%. So a really literal shift there for APAC. As of Q1, Q2 2023, and just a caveat, all the data I'll be presenting in this section is up to Q2 2023, was 9%. So it hasn't gone back down to the low that it was previously, but it has definitely narrowed in terms of the high it reached in 2022. But of course, we'll have to wait till the end of the year to get the figure there for the full year. But you can just see from the colors there, that dark green of the US has really gone down, and other countries have increased in terms of their as investment destinations. This is also, I think, because investors everywhere have this ESG mandate, and alt proteins is really important for that. But also on the supply side shows that we have a lot of innovation happening in other regions, particularly here in APAC, and that's something that investors are certainly seeing. And if I click one more on the right-hand side, we have another view of diversification, and this is looking at by pillar. So if we look at the first bar there, 2010 to 2021, we saw that plant-based investment was about 74% of total investment. But as of Q2 2023, over on the right, it's decreased to 26%. So this is a really drastic change that we've been seeing over the years, where the total has really changed, and this is much to do with these enabling technologies. So it's not really investing in one production platform, but seeing what's the best of all these different production platforms and how we combine them to create the best product. And certainly fermentation and cultivated meat have a lot of enabling ingredients that could be used in say plant-based products to improve them. So this is certainly a trend that we expect to continue. And there we see, let's convert these percentages into a total number and see how has investment been changing in APAC. In this top graph, you see the investments over time, and your eye is probably drawn to this spike in 2022. This was the year in which investment for fermentation and for cultivated surpassed regional all-time totals of each. And we've also seen a lot of country diversification. So you see the colors changing, a lot of blue coming on, and that's Australia and New Zealand, who have really invested a lot in the last couple of years. If we then click again, we can see the breakdown by pillar, and we can see Australia has the top spot in terms of all-time alternative protein investment in the region, followed by Singapore. And Australia leads in all-time alternative protein private investment for fermentation, as well as cultivated in the region. And I think it's really interesting to note that the public investment increased by over 900% in 2021 to 22, and that's really gone hand in hand with the private investment. So we're seeing a lot of the kind of private and public coming together, and Australia really leading the charge in APAC in terms of attracting investment into alternative proteins. So jumping from these numbers then and looking at what are the strategic corporates doing, and many of these, often through their corporate venture capital arms are making some of these investments. So here is a snapshot. There are more in the full report of some of the meat companies and how they've been embracing protein diversification. So we have here, the big players, maybe some of you in the call Thailand, which is one of the world's biggest meat companies. We have Nippon Ham and Ito Ham, the first and second biggest meat manufacturers in Japan. We have CJ, the biggest food company in South Korea. So really the biggest players, and all of these, which are all over $1 billion in revenue, have their own plant-based house. And as well as that, you can see from the colored circles, they've all been investing into different aspects of, or different technologies in alternative proteins. You see the yellow for cultivated, the blue for fermentation, and the green for plant-based. So pretty active, especially CJ there, with many investments. The other fees in the main report, many of those also have in-house brands. So we counted about 15 in total from these major meat and food companies. And I think it's important also to talk about, how important, again, as well as governments, the corporate investment is at this time, and really being a lifeline in this difficult investment climate. And of course, these benefits, could have a financial benefit, but they really often have a strategic benefit. So it could be to cement a particular capability or shore up a position in a supply chain. So it's these corporates kind of coming in at this early stage of the sector is really, really important for its long-term growth, and potentially providing capital that could be a bit more patient in some cases. So really encouraging to see these big players get in the game. Of course, it's a difficult climate, and we'll see how that changes over time. But up until now, it's been very interesting to see. Then we go to partnerships and understand a little bit what's been happening on the B2B side and also the end product side. And I'll just mention a couple of the trends in the partnerships. In the report, we go into a bit more detail on each of these partnerships, but I'll just mention a couple here. So one of the trends we saw is a rise in B2B partnerships between startups or smaller companies and these big strategic corporates in cell culture media. So you can kind of find the bubbles, which are all color-coded based on the alternative protein technology. But we have, for example, Ajinomoto and Supermeat, which is at the top, 3 in from the right. We have K-Cell Biosciences and CJ. We have XCell Therapeutics and Daesan Corporation from South Korea. All of these partnerships are focused on developing low-cost, effective cell growth media for cultivated meat. So we've seen a lot of activity here in this specialized area of CM. As well as that, we see end product partnerships. So for example, an alternative seafood, which, as I mentioned, is an important protein source for APAC. Blue Nalu in the cultivated meat startup from the US in 2023, renewed its partnership with a number of large corporates, including Thai Union, Pulmone in South Korea, and Mitsubishi as well. So that was some interesting end product partnerships we've seen. And another two I want to call out, which is a slightly different kind of partnership, which I think is very interesting. One is over on the bottom left, Mondenison Australia and Wide Open Agriculture. Mondenison Australia has committed to off-taking 60% of WOA's lupin-based protein ingredient. So showing that it's not just investment upfront, but providing the security in terms of an off-take contract that can really de-risk this investment in this case for Wide Open Agriculture. And Love Handle, so Meatable, the cultivated meat startup, and Love Handle, the plant-based restaurant, to open a hybrid innovation center in Singapore, which I believe is opening next year. And this is interesting, to get also the downstream side, the chefs involved in terms of creating these products that will be delicious for consumers. So different types of partnerships, some of the trends we see, but dive into the report for more detail on all these different partnerships. And among this, looking down to the company launches, we look to see also what kinds of companies are being launched. And something very interesting came out was that over 3/4 in 2022 are in the B2B space. And that's up from 26% in 2021. So a really big jump there in terms of a shift in focus from B2C to B2B. And this is a huge positive. I think it can't overstate, how positive this is, because companies more and more have options. So it doesn't make business sense for a company to go everywhere if you're a startup. But up until now, they really had no choice. They had to build their bioreactor, and then they had to scale their own facility, and they had to do everything. So really seeing this tech specialization on these different aspects that can overcome some of the quality and cost bottlenecks is, I think, going to be really game-changing. So this has been an encouraging trend. Of course, these B2B products also needs market, so we need the B2B and the B2C to develop, in parallel. But this has been quite an unmistakable trend that we saw when we looked at the data in terms of company launches. To dive in a little bit more on the startup side, we've created these maps in the report. So we have here, just for showcasing, cultivated, we have fermentation as well, we have B2B plant-based as well. So you can kind of have a look and see who's doing what. Maybe you spot some gaps in terms of where there might be an opportunity, but this is to kind of catalog what's happening in different aspects of the APAC ecosystem. So you can have a look at these in our report. So then going on to the final section before I'll hand over to Divya to take us through the consumer insights. So now you see at the top, we've been moving through the pipeline. So we have the government support, the R&D, the industry development and the funding, and now the scaling up. And to me, but maybe I'm biased because my my kind of focus is really on supply chain. I think this is really the key part where a lot needs to happen. So first, why is APAC important? Well, APAC does have resources and capabilities that enable it to be an efficient region for sector scale up. So I'll go into some of those. But it is important that smart scaling strategies are adopted for the industry. I mentioned before that we cannot treat alternative proteins like other software. We really need to be very cognizant of the specific values of death, and that it takes a very long time for this to scale. You have to keep building a new facility at demo scale, and then building a new facility at a slightly bigger scale. And there's a lot of risk involved, a lot of costly facilities, but maybe consumers won't buy it until it's cheap enough. So that's a really difficult problem to solve. So some of these smart scaling strategies will be important, I think, to overcome some of these challenges that we see in the supply chain when it comes to scale up. But first, looking at APAC, so obviously this is a condensed version of what you'll find in the report. And I do want to caveat, it takes a whole suite of enablers to be conducive to scale up. So APAC is not going to be for every company, for every technology, for every circumstance. But I think there are some capabilities and resources that's important to call out that makes APAC an interesting case for considering scaling up this sector. So the first is its agricultural resources. So obviously with alternative proteins, we're trying to decouple land and protein in a bigger way, but we're still dependent in a big way on natural resources. So I mentioned APAC as the largest producer of commodities. There's a lot of room to find additional value-added markets for existing crops. So that could be, Australia is doing this in a big way, looking at things like lupin for the animal feed sector and seeing how do we turn that into a higher value ingredient that also gives farmers more money, that gives them an extra income stream or a higher value added income stream if we target the alt proteins market. So really building that business case is happening really well in Australia, I think. But there's a lot more potential to do there. We've done a report on mung beans, as I mentioned, but there's many other crops that we've barely looked into as a sector. It's not just the plant proteins, it's also the biomass feedstocks. We have China, Thailand, Indonesia, all in the top 10 global sugarcane producers. Australia is also a significant producer of sugarcane. And these are feedstocks that are really important for the fermentation, especially the fermentation industry. And co-location with these feedstocks is important from a cost perspective. So because of this feedstock aspect, they have a lot of potential. Then going on to the development of the bio-based economies, so there's been significant investment and the emergence of biotech clusters in countries like China, South Korea, Japan, and Thailand. And they all have set a target or have roadmaps to develop their bioeconomies. So that is mostly in pharma, but more and more there's an acknowledgement of these other adjacent industries, one being our industry of food. But as well as that, it also offers a skilled labor pool because much of this labor will be transferable if you're from a pharma background to work in something like precision fermentation. And then third is the competitive and experienced manufacturing. So of course we have China. No one will, I think, doubt that China, is a manufacturing powerhouse. It's the world's largest workforce, and it's really key to scaling up other climate technologies, such as solar. We also have Southeast Asia, which is the world's third largest workforce, and unlike many others, is still growing. It's young and it's very cost competitive. So of course there are skills gaps, but there are existing capabilities, especially in the agri-food sector in terms of the manufacturing downstream, that could be used to great utility for alt proteins. So there's a lot of kind of latent potential already existing in APAC. And I'm just going to flash this and not go through it in detail, but basically the key point I want to put across here is that we need, well, one of the key things we believe as GFI is having these shared facilities, and we need to have these shared facilities every part of the supply chain, so that startups have an asset light way to scale. So we see a lot happening on the left-hand side in terms of offering shared research and pilot facilities, which is great, but we need much more of that on the right-hand side. So these more expensive, costly, risky facilities that many people are not willing to finance. That's really key, is how do we build those out? And I think getting different types of investors might not solve the problem or be possible, but we're really going to need funding from actors like governments and philanthropists to come in and de-risk some of that. So in my last slide before I hand over to Divya, I'm just going to go through some of case studies of, I think, smart scaling, starting with what I was just talking about. So de-risking the financing structure. So here, staying on this theme of CDMOs and why this shared approach to scaling is important for the sector. Highlighting this example of Scale Up Bio, I'm sure many of you know them, but they're not unique for being the first in Asia and the first in the world, as it says in the quote, to have this microbiome precision fermentation CDMO from 1 liter to 10,000 liters. But they're also unique because of their financing structure. So they have the Singapore government in the form of Nurasa, which is fully backed by Temasek, which is a sovereign wealth fund of Singapore, as well as ADM, a big strategic corporate in the commodity play. And investing in Scale Up Bio in this way, with this structure, has really enabled them to come in at a risky stage of the industry where maybe it wouldn't be possible to get something like venture capital. Then second, high value markets. So this is really about lowering the demand side risk. So finding infrastructure is half the battle. We have to produce the product, and then we need people who are willing to pay more, which is likely to happen in an early industry. And usually you have these niche adopters who are willing to pay more in many sectors, but that's still kind of the jury out on that in alt proteins. And in this case, we see an example of Turtle Tree, who pivoted from bovine milk to an affordable source of lactoferrin, which is a bioactive milk protein, which has many functional benefits, and which has a price of 700 to 1,500 USD per kilograms, versus bovine milk, which is $2 a gallon. So really realizing that this is a high value market where we can use that, create our revenue stream, and then start to build and scale and lower cost curves and so on. That's an approach that I expect we'll see more of happening in alt proteins. Then the third is modularity. So this is really about lowering the financing need. So instead of trying to have this financing structure to get people to come in and finance something very expensive, how do you actually make sure that your financing is lower in the first place? And this is all about modularity. So here, this is an example, maybe also of Cauldron, who are a CDMO in Australia in the precision fermentation space. And they're building multiple 100,000 liter bioreactors using smaller, smarter, cheaper facilities, what they call continuous fermentation, to be able to scale easier, because they don't need 200, 300 million for this 500,000 liter plant, but they need a 30 million facility with this 100,000 liter continuous line. So showing that how can you actually do scale differently, so that you can basically lower the costs and improve the financial attractiveness for investors. And then the final one is product market fit. So we can lower the demand side risk by looking at consumers, but we can also lower the supply side risk by really targeting where are the gaps on the supply side and solve a problem for manufacturers. So we're always focused on the consumer as kind of our usual customer, but often we have two customers. We have the consumer, but we have the manufacturer. And here, this is solving a manufacturer problem on the supply side by going after those segments of the protein market where there's a supply crunch in a particular sector and where they're looking for alternatives, not because of ESG, but because, from a cost perspective, from an availability perspective. And this is something that Base Food, this company from Malaysia, has done really well, realizing, that how can they create an offering for manufacturers who are experiencing these supply challenge in a way that will be conducive to their cost structure. So what they've done is started blending or creating a plant-based offering that offers a blended solution. So they can blend in their plant-based solution with their meat, conventional meat, to create this blended meat alternative. And Base Food has found that it's very difficult to go to a manufacturer and get them to wholesale switch on day one. But offering this kind of stepwise approach into the sector by starting with, blended formulation and maybe moving towards alt proteins solves a lot of problems, from cost to quality to incentives on the behalf of the manufacturer. So these are some kind of food for thought. I'm sure there are more. Would love to hear them. But this is how kind of the scale up challenges can be overcome at this point in the sector. Some ideas for the sector to ponder. So that's all on this section. So now we're in the final stage of the pipeline, and I will hand over to Divya before we take some questions, who will go over some of the insights from our consumer insight study. So over to you, Divya.
Thank you, Jennifer, and hello to everybody. For the next few minutes, we'll discuss some of the key highlights from a consumer insight study that is focused on plant-based meat and was conducted in the 6 Southeast Asian countries of Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. This study captured responses from around 6,000 people across the region, and in this presentation, we'll be looking at the highlights at the regional level. 2 of the many notable points from this study are that, not surprisingly, plant-based meat has a significant price gap to close, with it on an average being 35% more expensive than its meat counterparts. On the consumer end, people tend to associate affordability, nutritional value, and taste with plant-based meat. We'll dive deeper into these now in the next pages. Okay. Okay. So here, based on the awareness and trial levels of plant-based meat, clubbed with its planned consumption, the survey respondents were categorized into 6 segments, of which, if you look at the bottom 2, the enthusiasts and expanders are the ones who have tried plant-based meat and continue to consume it, with enthusiasts being more regular consumers in comparison to the expanders. We have curious number 4 and skeptics number 1, who have heard of plant-based meat but are yet to try it, with the curious being interested in trying out plant-based meat, while the skeptics show no interest. If you look at number 3, we have novices who have not heard of plant-based meat and showed varied interest in trying it out. We also have rejectors, number 2, who have tried plant-based meat but don't show as much interest in future consumption. In this group, around 1/5 of the survey respondents were enthusiasts, while 57% fall into the expanders and curious segments. So on the whole, though, there were around 82% people who wanted to try or continue consuming plant-based meat, something that Jennifer led our presentation with. We will see more of it in the next few pages. Interestingly or not interestingly, enthusiasts tend to have higher incomes in comparison to other segments. And Thailand is where they were more commonly based. I think the key interesting point for me here when we were doing this was that respondents either want to reduce the consumption of red meat, except for enthusiasts who want to do the opposite. But for all other meat, all segments showed leaning towards increasing their consumption. So on the next page, we will take a look at one of the key challenges that the industry faces, which is the price point. Based on the data for new plant-based meat product launches between 2022 and the second quarter of 2023 in the Southeast Asian region of the countries that we just discussed, the average price premium the plant-based meat currently commands is around 35% in comparison to its meat counterparts. This, of course, varies across different forms of the product. Nevertheless, overall, this is an expensive category at the moment. There's a large price gap to close with regards to the meat counterparts. Now, continuing on the topic of the price, if we see the next slide, we asked whether they would purchase plant-based meat or meat at different prices. The skeptics who hadn't tried of plant-based meat and didn't plan on consuming it showed the highest price sensitivity amongst all segments. The curious are also the most price sensitive amongst the top interested segments in plant-based meat. That is the enthusiasts group, the expanders, and the curious. Overall, there's high price sensitivity amongst all segments. Around 47% of the respondents claim that they would purchase plant-based meat instead of meat at 20% higher price. However, if plant-based meat was 20% cheaper than meat, 80% respondents said they choose it. So simply put, price is an important factor for consumer adoption. On the next page, you will explore what people think about the taste of plant-based meat. When we asked about their perceptions regarding plant-based meat as a whole, amongst other choices, 2 choices were related to taste, whether it tasted good or whether it tasted bad. Just a note here that this was a multiple choice question. So what we see on this page is representative of people who selected these in the top 3 perception choices. Overall, there are more people who think plant-based meat tastes good in comparison to people who think it tastes bad, which is good news, 38% in comparison to 8% on an average. Skeptics, the top ones, are the one exception segment who are roughly equally split between saying that tastes good and it tastes bad. It's also interesting to note that if you just click, Jennifer, 34% of the respondents would eat more plant-based meat if it tasted better, in comparison to 28% people who would eat more if it tasted like meat. So this is an interesting observation for us at the Regional Insight. And for the same perception question on the next slide, we asked the perception regarding health. So people who selected health in the top 3 perception choices were then presented with the options of health benefits that would make them choose plant-based meat over meat. Now, the key motivators for the group are lower cholesterol and fat, equally good protein as meat, absence of hormones, preservatives, and other chemicals, and ease of digestion. It might be just worthwhile to take a pause and note that while the effects of cholesterol, fat, protein, chemicals, etc., can take a while to show, digestion is a more immediate experience, something companies can take into consideration. On the next page, we will discuss an ideal scenario. So the ideal scenario is that all of the concerns of the respondents with regards to plant-based meat, whether it be price or it be taste or it be health, anything that they mentioned in the survey, if all of those were addressed, we found out that an impressive 63% of them would choose to consume plant-based meat, either often or always. And then there's another approximately 28% people who would want to consume it sometimes. This proxy is an indication of the latent demand and interest for plant-based meat that can be tapped into by companies in the sector, noting the main barriers and motivators that drive purchase behaviors. We also explored people's interest in blends, which we'll see on the next slide. By blends here, we refer to a combination of alternative protein and conventional meat, which is an emerging subcategory in the alternative protein spectrum. More than half the people expressed high interest in it. Notably, if you see the skeptics and rejectors who didn't lean favorably towards plant-based meat tend to prefer blends. Even the segments who had higher levels of interest in plant-based meat showed preference for blends, closely following it. That will be the end of the presentation from our end today. We do want to let you know that a detailed report based on this consumer insight study will be coming out shortly in a few weeks' time. I think it will be interesting to see how the observations will vary or concur for each of the 6 countries when compared to Southeast Asia as a region. We'd also like to remind you that GFI APAC State of the Industry report, on which this webinar is based, is published on our website. You can scan the QR code on the screen, which will direct you to the website link. And Valerie, I will hand it over to you now.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer and Divya, for your very detailed and informative presentation of GFI APAC State of the Industry report. So we're going to start our Q&A session now. So for anyone who has questions, you can submit them in the Q&A section. But I actually see that in the chat box, we do have, I think we have 2 questions. So one is from Bridget. So actually, I might actually let Bridget to ask your question in person. So I'm going to allow you to talk so you can ask your question.
Yeah, it was nice to see you on the screen, and congratulations for this presentation and very nice report. I think the question I had was on consumer around the key drivers to accept a need like affordability, taste, and nutrition. And because you presented the answer to this question in a different way, perhaps I should wait for the reports when you provide a report to see and understand what are the key drivers and motivation by target population. Because you show different typology of consumers for whom certainly price is less a key barrier than perhaps nutrition and health, and vice versa. So I can wait for the report if you don't have it on top of mind.
I'll take the question if I understand it correctly. There were a bunch of options that were presented to the respondents on what is the perception with regards to plant-based meat. Nutrition is one of them, health was one of them, tastes good, bad, is pricey. So I think there were around 10 factors or so. I can't recall each one of them right now, apologies, but you will find them in the State of the Industry report.
Yes, so my question is, in a nutshell, is did you find differences of key drivers by type of consumer? That was my question.
Yes. It varies across. It varies across each of the segments. And we'll talk more about that in a detailed insight, but you're right in that even within the enthusiast segment, the top 3 factors will vary across people who are comprised in that group.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Okay, so we also have one more question from Ken Chu Tan. So I will also allow you to talk so you can elaborate more on your question as well.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Ken Chu Tan from Dassault Systems. I very much appreciate what's being presented today. I'm a big fan of the work of GFI. On the copy of the survey, what's presented was a taste, texture, and price were different significant business drivers for adoption. And I wonder how significant is the topic nutrition as a driver, as a reason for adoption amongst consumer segments. Oftentimes, we know most brands, startup position their offering with sustainability as the value proposition, the most significant value proposition. And we know from consumer perspective, while they appreciate that, that is not a very significant business driver. Depending on but here, the rest of Asia. So the question, how significant is nutrition driver?
I can take that prior question. Thank you. And it's an interesting point. Although nutrition is very much talked about in this industry, this survey kind of guided us to understand that price is the biggest challenge that consumers face as a barrier in adopting or even trying plant-based meat. Health is a factor, nutrition is a factor, concerns for maybe like animal and environment are factors, but the primary barrier is the price. If consumers, and if I go to the slide, the price elasticity slide, if we can move to that, slide 26. Yeah, if you look at it here, right, even people who have a somewhat, and I'll use this word liberally, negative perception of plant-based meat, when the product is cheaper, around 50% of them are willing to try it out. So in our opinion, nutrition is an important factor, but it's not the most important factor. It's more important, I think, amongst the people who identified themselves as health-driven, people who shows health as one of the important associations, but not everybody chose health in the top 3 factors, is what I'm trying to say. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And we have one more question from Afif. I'm gonna allow Afif to speak. If not, I can also, oh yeah, go ahead, Afif.
Okay, perfect. Hi, morning, everyone. My name's Afif Grisette. I'm from Upstream Foods in the Netherlands. My question was basically about the TEA. So we've actually conducted our TEA already, which is very early in our process. We are still at a laboratory bench scale and looking to move into bioreactors hopefully within the next year. My question is it more important to have an accurate TEA rather than to just make assumptions and have a generalized TEA? Because what we've done in our TEA is we have assumed the use of certain compounds in order to calculate what our price at scale would be. However, in our research, we are realizing that some of those compounds are not actually working very well. So my question is accuracy more important when it comes to TA, or just having a general cost idea at scale more important?
Yeah, good question. I guess three things. I mean, one is a model is a model, right? Every TA, even in more advanced industries, is a model of how reality can be, and especially in the case of something like cultivated meat, which is based on early analysis and doesn't have the full range of possibilities on offer.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a model and more difficult in CM. But two, I think that we really are a believer in TAs, which is why as GFI, we commission those and we put a lot of effort into doing those. They can be really critical for kind of uncovering where are the opportunities, where are the barriers. And so I'd say like third point is it's not really about the TA, but the kind of the way that you talk about the TA and the way you present it as, it's not a finite conclusion, but it's, on best available evidence. Of course, you have to be very dynamic in kind of responding to it. But I'd say a lot of the challenges we have around basically interpretation of RTA, or, a TA goes up and then everyone jumps on it as wrong. It's like, you cannot take it as fact, but it's like a guide. So I'd say it's all about kind of the framing of the TA, but in my opinion, I think the more accurate and the more comprehensive that TA, the better. And I think that's something that investors are more and more looking for, to really understand, how's the scale up going to work. So that's my opinion. I don't know if our scientists would disagree, but I think you're going on the right lines if I hear about what you're doing.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, and our next question is from someone called Jonathan. And I've allowed Jonathan to speak.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, so I'm Jonathan Ramakrishna. I'm a student at the National University of Singapore, and I'm currently involved in a project to increase plant-based proteins acceptance in local food in Singapore. So given the discussion about the price sensitivity and how it's the most important factor, how then can we create a value proposition for consumers to provide an entry point for them into these alternative proteins? Because especially in Singapore, I think price sensitivity is a very big issue. And right now, plant-based proteins are mostly in higher end cafes and restaurants. So my project is to help the everyday Singaporean have access to it. So kind of struggling with how we should approach it, but I appreciate how the report has created the segments for skeptics and the rejectors, novices, the types of consumers. So this is my question.
Yeah, don't worry, Jonathan. It's not only you. I think the whole industry is struggling with this question. I mean, I guess there were two things that come to mind. The first is I think we really have to be strategic in the kinds of markets that we're going after. I mean, if we go after something like chicken, like it's really commoditized, right? It's really low cost. But why I showed this example of turtle trees, because I think they've been really smart in choosing a market where they can kind of tap into something that's more expensive, in scarcer supply, that really provides consumers with a reason to buy, that offers them a lot of benefits over maybe what they would be having anyway. So I think choosing your market strategically is really, really important, which isn't to say that a chicken play doesn't work, but I think it's much more difficult to kind of sell those benefits. And I mean, honestly, I think as a sector, we have to be a lot more skeptical of how much of premium like consumers are willing to pay. And I think the assumption that consumers will pay a really high premium for these products is, I'm not sure if that's true, because as Divya showed and as we discussed, like what was surprising to me about our research is consumers already associate plant-based meat with taste, and good taste, and they associate it with good health, yet they still want a cheaper price. So it's like, it's almost a given that you need these benefits and you need, an equal or cheaper price. So I think we have to be a lot more aggressive on the cost side, and that requires a very different scaling strategy. So not sure if that was so helpful. It's really a larger industry problem, but I think we have to be much more kind of critical about the kinds of premiums that we're able to attract. I think that's what we are realizing from our consumer study.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. So on to our next question, which is by Sam. And Sam, I have allowed you to, I've given you the unmute option.
I'm an analyst for a Level VC, advisor for Level VC also. I just saw an article on LinkedIn and says Nestle has launched several kinds of plant-based seafood in the market. This article also says that there's a lot of sudden growth in interest in entering the alternative seafood sector. But the article doesn't explain why is there so much interest in alternative seafood. I just wonder if any of you know the reason. Does it have anything to do with Japan's nuclear wastewater release in the ocean over the several decades? What is the background and for the sudden surge in the interest in alternative seafood? Do you have any idea? This is not answered in many articles I've read. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the answer, I don't think it's probably tied to the nuclear waste release. I think actually like seafood has been much more comparatively neglected when we look at like plant-based launches of other meats compared to seafood. So I would imagine that maybe there's more interest because it's more of a gap. So companies kind of see maybe they can differentiate in this area and launch an alt seafood product because there are less of them. Another reason I think is, APAC companies are interested in seafood because it's so consumed here and it's such a key protein source. And, when we look at our study, it's like the one protein, or well, not the one protein, but one of the proteins that people don't want to stop consuming. So there's really a solid kind of consumer market for it. And then I'd say the third reason is many of the big seafood companies want to do something that's already in their wheelhouse, right? So we have, folks like Thai Union and Maruha Nichiro who are, rather after another meat, and most of the big companies are getting into the sector will go over something like alt seafoods. I wouldn't say that it's, I guess the surge, I'm not sure if there's a surge, like according to our data, it seems actually comparatively neglected. But I think there's good reason to think that it will, at least grow as an offering because of the reasons I've mentioned. So hope that's helpful.
All right, so just one final question, again from Ken, which is do you know what is the typical lead time to launch a new product in the plant-based category?
I'd say it's quite hard to give an answer. I mean, probably the biggest variance is whether you do it, in-house or you use like a co-manufacturer, right? So if you can go, for instance, for example, we have SG Protein as a co-manufacturer who can kind of do it for you. I would say the pipeline you wrote in the chat is probably about right, because it's not just about developing the product, but also finding the distributor and finding all these markets and so on. So I'm not really sure, to be honest, about that timeline. I don't know if we have that data anywhere, but I think it's a bit too variable to be able to give a definitive answer. But if I come up with something, I'll let you know.
Okay, so all right, I think we are about come up to time for our webinar today. So Another big thank you to Jennifer and Divya for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. And thank you everyone for joining us today as well. We're going to have a feedback form that will appear at the end of the webinar. So it will pop up on your browser. It only has 3 short questions. And if you could just spare 1 to 2 minutes to fill it up, it would be much appreciated so we know your feedback about this webinar and about the report. If you haven't downloaded the report yet, you can scan the QR code to get the link to download the report. So Jennifer, maybe you can go to the slide, or Divya, to show the QR code one more time. Yep, so just scan that to download our report, or if not, you can also always find it on our website and search for it. Should be pretty easy to find. So thank you so much everyone for attending our webinar today. We hope you found it useful, and we have a good day ahead. Thank you.